Well, hello and welcome back to Coming Home Network Presents. I'm Matt Swaim, Director of Outreach for the Coming Home Network, and this is an opportunity to talk about some of the issues that people deal with on their way into the Catholic Church and some of the ways they worked through them. Today we get to talk to some Seventh-day Adventists who became Catholic, and that may be a surprise to some of you, probably who did not know that that's a thing, but it is a thing. I've got at least 3 people for whom that was a thing that we're going to talk to here in just a moment. But if you want to see previous episodes, or if you want to connect with any of the resources we have at the Coming Home Network, go to CHNetwork.org. We also have an online community where people can interact with one another and share experiences and prayer and fellowship. That's community.chnetwork.org. And of course, if you want to support our work so we can continue to be a support for people who are on the journey and asking these questions, then you can go to chnetwork.org/donate. All right, so I'm Matt Swaim. I mentioned me. Now it's time to introduce a couple of people, actually 3 people. This is most people we've ever had on one of these episodes, and I'm very excited. Arthur and Teresa Beem with us, also Norman bin Yazid, and all of them have Seventh-day Adventist backgrounds. Arthur, Teresa, Norman, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, we're not going to be able to cover the full narrative arc of your stories, but I encourage people to go check out the Journey Home episodes featuring Arthur and Teresa. I think Teresa even did one by herself at one point. Norman recorded one. It has not aired yet, but definitely be looking out for that. And Arthur and Teresa have even done a written version of their story together, if you want to get a piece of the narrative flow of how all this fit. But I want to start with a question that I ask a lot of people when I get them on from various denominations, and that is, what qualifies you to talk about Seventh-day Adventism? So, if you could, we'll go ladies first. That's what we like to do most of the time. Teresa, what is your experience of Seventh-day Adventism that really kind of qualifies you to speak on this topic?
Well, let's see. Besides being a multi-generational Seventh-day Adventist, I think my great-grandmother started the Sabbath School movement for the Adventist Church in Oklahoma. And I was a writer. I worked for the Seventh-day Adventist school system. I taught in their Sabbath schools. I wrote for the magazines. My family members were part of the GC. I was deeply integrated into the church. Both my husband and I went to Adventist schools from elementary through college, and we graduated from the Southwestern Adventist College in Keene, Texas, which is a mecca for Adventists. I think it's almost a fully Adventist little town. I mean, there's some non-Adventists, but it's thought of as an Adventist town.
All right, Arthur, you were sharing some of your Adventist street cred with me before this, and I know that if you share it all, that'll be the whole rest of the episode.
Right.
But if you could share a little bit about, your experience and your family experience, really, in Adventism.
So the short version is I'm multi-generational also. At least I know my grandfather, my dad, started out a Seventh-day Adventist teacher, then went to Seventh-day Adventist principal for years, got known for going in and fixing problem schools, then became the educational superintendent over Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, and then was a pastor on top of that from even before I was born, Sabbath school, church, school, all the way through grade school, middle school, high school, and all the way out through my BSN in nursing.
All right.
So, yeah. Solid.
And you said there was a radio station involved in there somewhere?
Yeah, the Keene radio station was set up by my aunt and uncle, Raymond and Anna Beem. Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
So, yeah, we were just all through that whole region for Adventism. Yeah, very well known there.
Yeah. It's very well known where I am in the D.C. area. It's very well known in places like, Battle Creek, Michigan, and the home of Corn Flakes, which is an Adventist invention if people don't know it. But Norman, how about you? Because yours is not as 5,000 generations back. Not that you can go 5,000 generations back with Adventism, but it doesn't go far as back as the Beams, does it?
Yeah, so I'm Adventist from my mother's side. I guess her family they're Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up, became a ministered in the Adventist Church. Went to La Sierra, Andrews University for my master's there, and worked for the Southeastern California Conference.
That's a lot of Adventist name dropping, and I bet you that there's some Adventists watching who probably have like deep connections to some of the places you all mentioned. But I have a sheet. It has 5 million questions for Adventists on there. I'm going to pare it down a little bit, but one of them is that Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists can all go, to a Stephen Curtis Chapman concert, and they're all Christians to one another. Yeah. Adventists, I mean, Norman, were you aware that you were not like other Protestants? I mean, like, did you have a sense that Adventism was like different than other kinds of like, I don't know, let's say like evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, certainly. For one, worshiping on the Saturday Sabbath, right? That emphasizes a distinctive mark, not eating certain foods. So yeah, those were some of the identifying features, along with Ellen G. White, right? Her writings. So those were some of the things that I grew up as distinctive marks of Adventism, apart from other Christians.
Now, when you were experiencing this call to ministry, I mean, what did that look like for you as an Adventist? Like, what did you think that you were going to be doing? What did you believe that God was calling you to do in going into ministry as a Seventh-day Adventist?
Yeah, I guess more about preaching the Adventist message, and taking charge of a church. But I actually pursued ministry. More because I love the intellectual life, reading and studying. So that was the way to pursue this interest further.
Yeah. So we've got that going on now. Arthur and Teresa. This is a lot more in your family and coming down. Your education is coming from generations of Adventist experience. Arthur, for you, and Norman, you hinted at some of the stuff, Sabbath worship, diet. Like, what do you remember about dietary stuff and other kinds of rules that probably made you like a little bit different than the other kids on your block?
A lot of bit different. Yeah. A lot of bit different. I think looking back, I think it's the checking every solitary label you look at in the store to make sure there's no lard in it is like the number one thing you look for. And, I was raised right when the first Vegemite started to come out. So that would be another very significant thing that kind of, all your friends would laugh at you like, fake hamburger. What in the world is fake hamburger, And
now it's like the hottest thing going, right? I mean, Now you guys are so far ahead of the trend. There was Beyond Burger back then. Are you kidding me?
That's right. And it was called TVP back in the 70s, where it was hard
textured
rocks.
Vegetable protein. Oh, yeah.
Yes. So for me, the dietary was huge. The fact that you couldn't go outside and play on Saturday with no real particular explanation for it. I mean, it's Sabbath, and it never was a real explanation. And so for me, that another thing that was very significant was that separation of the Sabbath separation from life. Well,
different. There are plenty of Christians who are not Seventh-day Adventists who get a lot of rules and no explanation. Yeah. And there are a lot of people who get a lot of rules and they're like, well, we'll put on a good face for the church people, but we're going to do our thing at home. Teresa, if I recall correctly, that was more of your approach, where you would drink Dr. Pepper, but just not in front of fellow Adventists.
Oh, yeah. You know how in the spectrum of Catholics, there's quite a spectrum. But when you talk about the liberal and conservative Adventists, there's not quite the spectrum because, he wasn't allowed to have Dr. Pepper.
Right.
Absolutely. That was a no-no. But our family was wild and crazy, and we went out to eat on Sabbath, and we ended up, occasionally we would eat meat.
Right.
And so, we were very, very wild. As a matter of fact, his parents didn't particularly want him to marry me.
I was the
so
Orthodox
wild.
Adventist, which I grew up totally Orthodox. She was the very, I don't want to say wild, but it was definitely more evangelicalized,
Sure.
Kind of like the people in California, right? Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about that, Norman, and your own experience, like, and maybe you can explain too where some of this dietary stuff comes from, because maybe people have met Messianic Jews, Christians who are sort of Messianic who keep like kosher laws, but where's it coming from for an Adventist? Like this whole idea of the dietary question, and really kind of the question of a real focus on health in general.
Yeah, so it comes from Leviticus 11, right? That's one of the big verses or Bible chapters that's used. It lists all the sort of clean and unclean foods. The story of Noah, how Noah had to bring, I think, 7 pairs of clean animals, and so those passages in Scripture are used as justification for that practice.
So a lot of this comes back to Ellen G. White. So if you could, Norman, maybe explain a little bit about who this figure is and how she really started this whole movement that, again, is not like Baptists, it's not like Presbyterians, it's not like Pentecostals.
Yeah, well, from what I remember, is that she was one of the followers of William Miller, right? William Miller had read passages from Daniel, and he predicted the coming of Christ. That didn't pan out. So Ellen White was one of his followers who claimed to have a vision or visions, right? That helped to understand these prophetic timelines better. And as her this prophetic ministry grew, she became one of the founders of this Adventist movement.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the William Miller part of it, because there are a whole bunch of movements that kind of come out from the Millerite world, and also from really that whole era in American history. It's amazing how many religious movements in the United States spring up. Mormonism is from that world too, and Jehovah's Witnesses and many others.
Christian Scientists.
Christian Science is very much in there, and that's another one focused very much on health. Arthur, Teresa, maybe you could like share a little bit of your own experience of what kind of position and I guess authority was given to the thought and teaching of Ellen G. White in your world.
Well, every single thing that we did was based, not everything, but I mean, a large majority of what we did was based on Ellen White. But in our family, we just didn't talk about that. In other words, it wasn't, we didn't know where it was from. We just thought it was from Scripture or what was right. Whereas, it was more directly from Arthur's family. They did a lot of just reading. Didn't you guys every morning?
Right. They would have worship books that were designed by Adventist writers that would incorporate, Ellen G. White's writings into it. For me, it's kind of like the scene from, don't look at the man behind the curtain type of thing for me. So
the Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, the Wizard of Oz.
Now, to be fair, you weren't really allowed to watch movies growing up, so it's okay if that.
It's what I heard on the street,
So
yeah. Can't go to movie theaters,
you were allowed to watch him on TV. You just couldn't go to the theater.
Not in the theater. That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. Actually, that was the case for a lot of Protestants in that era.
Yeah,
not just Adventists.
Everything was infused with Ellen White. Everything. And so even if it wasn't, even reading Bible passages was always kind of bounced off of Ellen White. It couldn't just stand on its own. They would always bring Ellen White into it and say, well, this is the way Sister White would see it.
Yeah. And
everything had to be skewed and glanced off of Ellen White, which as a kid, it was confusing to me. I didn't really understand. If the Bible was that important, and you're talking about the hand of God writing the Bible, therefore, what are we talking about this Mrs. White thing? I didn't understand, especially when I was young, at first, what the whole thing was. But yeah, everything came up from Ellen White.
Well, I was going to save this question to the end, but I'm just going to ask it now. So there are Protestants who, a great many of them, are sola scriptura adherents, right? They at least profess to believe. Now, in practice, in my world, in Protestantism, this is what we said, but we functioned kind of like under tradition and magisterium. But we said that we held the Bible alone as our sole rule of faith. We rejected the idea of tradition. We rejected the idea of a teaching authority that could tell us what the Bible meant. Norman, for you as an Adventist, like, you had a magisterium, didn't you? I mean, Ellen White essentially functioned as your magisterium, correct?
Yeah, essentially. They're always very careful to, emphasize sola scriptura, but if you had an interpretation that differed from Ellen White, if you saw things different from Ellen White, you had to fix your interpretation. There was no question of, finding mistakes in her or acknowledging any mistake that she might have made. So, in fact, probably the Adventists are stricter about adhering to Ellen White than maybe we are with some of the Pope's sayings and writings. So.
Yeah, by far.
Now, was there just to kind of put this in context, since you mentioned the Pope, was there like a successor to Ellen White, right? Or was it just Ellen White?
Ellen White, just Ellen White.
Ellen White.
Yeah. Which leads to a very interesting situation that I will save to the end, and that is, how much of Adventism rests on the credibility of one person, which is a very precarious thing. Mormons are in a similar situation. The Millerites were, by the way, and when Miller's credibility fell through, the whole Millerite thing fell through. But I want to talk a little bit about something that a lot of those movements that all sprung up in that era have in common. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a bunch of others, a lot of utopian, like, restorationist movements. And that is this idea of a great apostasy. What was your impression about, like, what happened to the church after the death of the last apostle? I'll start with you, Teresa.
Adventists believe that the church immediately went off the rails. They do not believe, when I was young, I don't know about you, Norman, maybe in a seminary it was different when you were there, but when we grew up, the Adventists absolutely rejected all the church fathers. They did not accept the church fathers as legitimate. They accepted them as Catholic forgeries. And so, they were immediately, after the apostles, we went off the rails.
Was that pretty much your understanding then, Norman?
Yeah. So, I think, Constantine was the one who said to sort of ruin it all, and he was the one who implemented the Sunday law, Sunday worship, and all of these deviations from the original faith. But that's pretty much the experience. We did learn about the early church fathers in seminary, but they were kind of just a historical curiosity. The professor never kind of made the connection between, why we had to study them and what their connection was with us, let's say, as Seventh-day Adventists. So,
when you read in 150 AD, around 150 AD, which is, nearly 200 years before Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, you read Justin Martyr saying that Christians are worshiping on Sunday because that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead, and he connects it even with, like, the creation. When you read that and you find a source like that that's that early, so Justin would have been alive during the lifetimes of the people who were taught by the apostles, and Justin is saying, this is what we have received, as though this is coming from something authority. Like, what would you have done with that? Like, what would you have said about what Justin Martyr's deal was?
I can tell you, when I wrote the book, it's okay not to be a Seventh-day Adventist. I actually wrote to a lot of Adventist pastors at the high level. I even wrote Randy Roberts, who is the pastor of Loma Linda Church, and I said, so what is the thinking of the church? And because the church, Ellen White wrote that these were apostate writings. In other words, they were falsified. But Randy Roberts did say that they're now becoming more and more acceptable. So I know that there's been a gradual change in the Adventist acceptance of those. So the fact that you even they brought them up in your seminary training. They did not bring them up in seminary training, when we were young. They were just considered absolute apocryphal writings.
Right.
Yeah, Norman, you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, most likely the justification would be, it's not in the Bible, so, you can just kind of dismiss it.
All right, so before we move on, do you have any questions for each other?
I did remember watching your testimony, when I was kind of curious about the Catholic faith, and I remember the abortion question was a big one, right? Like,
yes.
Why was that why was that sort of a big issue for you at the time that kind of propelled you to look to Catholicism?
Yeah, and if you could clarify what Adventists believe about abortion.
Well, I mean, you should know, you went to La Sierra, Norman, and La Sierra is dedicated. They have a building dedicated to the foremost abortionist in the world, who's a Seventh-day Adventist. At least he doesn't anymore. But what's his name? Allred, Dr. Allred. And
Okay.
so I thought that our church was pro-life, and then in high school and then in college, I started hearing about young girls getting abortions, Adventist girls getting abortions. And then one of our OBGYNs offered a free abortion to one of my friends because she was unwed. And that started me thinking, okay, what is going on here? Adventists are... And then I found out they were not just a little bit involved. They filed amicus curiae briefs with the U.S. Supreme Court over these things. I mean, it's one of the foremost areas where they pushed abortion was in Hawaii, and it was the Adventist church there, and the Adventist hospital there. Yeah. And so, I mean, the church has been very, very involved in, and I was horrified. I could not believe that this church that claimed to be the remnant that kept the Ten Commandments. That's their big spiel, is that they keep the Ten Commandments. And then they looked askance at abortion, the murder of unborn children. And I couldn't find an Adventist. I just freaked out and started asking around. I couldn't find an Adventist that was pro-life, including in my own family, because they were so scared of the Sunday law. They said, if you get politically involved in any way, shape, or form. See, Norman knows what I'm talking about. Look at his expression.
This is why I want you to ask questions of each other, because you guys got some shared experience here.
Oh, absolutely. You can almost tell who's an Adventist, and if you're walking in the mall, it's like, that's an Adventist. But the Adventist church has been very pro-choice until just lately. And that just horrified me. And the more I got closer and more involved, we started my husband and I started the very first Adventist pro-life movement called Adventists for Life. And I was the president and founder. And you cannot believe how deep this fear of us as Seventh-day Adventists getting involved in politics, because they said the minute we try to step out and say abortion is wrong, that's going to open up the door for religious persecution of Adventists.
Yes.
Which is the Sunday law.
Yeah,
that's the big boogeyman in the room. That 10,000-pound gorilla in the room is the Sunday law.
Yeah.
Well, help us understand this, because some people are like, what are you talking about? Like, the government's always going to be, at odds with the church, and, Christianity and the state are always going to be in tense terms or whatever. It's a different level for Adventists. I wonder if you could explain that, Norman. Like, the fear that might be going along with Adventists, and like that, what kind of fear of reprisal is built into that worldview and that theology? Yeah,
I guess it stems from a particular reading of, say, what Catholics have done in the past, right, with the Inquisition and all that. But there is this very real fear that one day, and this is also based on a reading of Revelation, that the two beasts will cooperate, but one day the Pope will influence the government of the United States to enact Sunday law, and this will be worldwide, and this will bring about the persecution of Adventists in particular, for worshiping on the true Sabbath.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for people to imagine that's the battlefront. A lot of Christians are, rightly, I think, worried about religious liberty questions, but I don't think any of them are going to be like, well, the church, the state is going to decide what day we're allowed to go to church, right? And that's not a fear that a Baptist has.
Yeah.
What's interesting is when you ask an Adventist, say, or just inform an Adventist, you do realize we go to Mass every Saturday.
Yes.
So what's the problem?
Yeah.
You find out what where the rubber meets the road is.
Yeah.
Being Seventh-day Adventist on their books.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's not going to church on Saturday, really, when it comes down to it. But they don't know how to answer that one because they've always been told we're just these apostate Sunday worshipers,
Yeah. They don't know that we do worship on Saturday too, and every day actually, right?
And every day, yeah.
All the days. But I want to get to something else too, because it's also tricky for people to leave the Seventh-day Adventist world because, Arthur, when you say on the books, you're not talking about in like some abstract way, right?
No. Physical books of Adventist books. In Teresa's book, It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-day Adventist, there's a part in there. I used to work with a guy who his son was in Vietnam and took great pride because he would plant booby traps, and he got so good at it that they would bet to see which direction they could blow the guy. I'm going to blow him northeast 100 feet or whatever. Well, basically, you felt coming out of Adventism, I felt that way. Every exit is mined in some sort of way of fear. It's mined with some sort of fear of you're going to be deceived. It's just all a deception. And so it's a lot of fear base.
Well, Ellen White makes a prophecy that in the last days, right before the Lord comes, there's going to be a great apostasy in the Adventist church. And great lights are going to fall. And not only that, but the people that leave Adventism are going to be the spearheads of those that persecute Adventists in the last days.
And now, qualify persecute.
Well, we're going to lead
Kill.
it. Yeah, right.
Kill.
That's right.
We're talking physically kill them.
And so according to Ellen White, see, all they have to do is say, according to Ellen White, you guys did exactly what she said.
Right.
See, we felt exactly, we've proven Ellen White to be true because we leave Adventism. And so they use this against us. And so it's very, very difficult because especially becoming Catholic, because that was her prediction. And so I keep telling my Adventist friends and family, don't worry, I've got my eye on that Sunday law. I will tell you if the Pope or somebody, because I love you guys and I'm not gonna let us persecute you.
Norman, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in sermons, a lot of sermons, especially when sermons pertaining to the Sabbath commandment, they'd always take these quotes from the Pope or an encyclical or some Catholic writing out of context, to kind of hint that look, this is what they're planning all along, and this is what they're trying to usher in. So the fear is reinforced quite regularly, I'd say.
All right. Well, we've said enough things about like all the baggage that you bring, with you, but let's talk a little bit about the fact that you're all still Christians who have Christ at the center of your life. So obviously something that happened there was formative and made you want to pursue where Christ was leading you, no matter where that was. Arthur, I wonder if you could maybe speak to that kind of formation that you got and how it really formed you to take the words of Christ. And I mean, the Sabbath is just one example. The commands of God, seriously.
Well, yeah, that's actually a miracle in and of itself. The whole process for me was a miracle. Was the thought of Christ, his life, death, and resurrection, right? Mm-hmm. meant a lot to me. I didn't understand it. It never was particularly explained, but it meant a lot. Authority meant a lot. Adventists take a lot of authority, all their authority from Ellen White. So for me, there are things that Adventists do that are strangely like Catholicism. You have the Pope, you have Ellen White, you have the Magisterium, you've got the General Conference and the Union and all of that everything kind of filters down to the masses, so to speak. And so for me, when I found, or even started to think about Catholicism and being informed from actually good Catholic sources, it made me look at where I came from and said, oh, they basically are just taking from Catholicism and plugging in their own people to the structure of Catholicism. So for me, the not piousness, but the devoutness. That's the best way to put it. Very devout, and generally kind, very kind group of people, that to me meant a lot, but the authority status really is what got to me. So once I hit and even saw any truth about Catholicism, I was like, wait a second. They've been around longer than 150, 200 years. Mm-hmm. I wonder how long they've been around. And then the ball started rolling there for me.
Yeah. How about you, Teresa?
Deep in history.
Yeah.
Well, from the time you are in what they call cradle roll, you're a toddler and you go to Sabbath school and you hear that one day you're going to have to give your life for the truth. And even though it is Sabbath for them, you do have, they instill such a love that you are prepared to go to martyrdom for your beliefs. Mm-hmm. And when you associate that with Christ, and instead of, if you at all incorporate it into Christ himself, then that teaches you wherever truth is, I'm following it. And I'm going to die for it. And I really do believe that is one of the reasons Adventists probably will make the best Catholics. So,
yeah. Well, there's a bias in this room on that question, so I don't want to dwell on it too long. But Norman, did you have anything to add from your own experience about some of the things that formed you as a Seventh-day Adventist that really you see as gifts and like really have made an impact on the way that you understand yourself as a Catholic today?
Sure. Yeah, taking the Bible very seriously, right? Adventists pride themselves in sort of in being very careful about interpreting Scripture, devoting a lot of time and even studying the original language of Scripture. So I'd say taking Scripture seriously helped me to, that was a formative part of being a Christian, or that there's continuity there between my Adventism and Catholicism.
The stakes are a little bit different for you because you were in ministry, like formal ministry. I know that's when Ken Hensley and you connected was, you were at a fairly wild point in your journey. You're in a different situation than Arthur and Teresa, and I want to talk about their situation in a minute because it brings up an interesting nuance. But you went straight from Adventism to Catholicism, right?
Yes, yes.
So, as you were making that transition, how are you? What were the gaps in Adventism that you saw fulfilled in Catholicism? Like, what was the point that you reached in Adventism and you were like, this is not enough, I need something more? And what were the ways that Catholicism filled in those blanks?
Yeah, for sure. One was, why do I have to be physically present in church? And this was a question that the younger generation were asking me because, they could just watch service online. And studying that made me realize, well, for the early church, it was receiving our Lord in the Eucharist, and the Eucharist was the center of worship, not the sermon. So that was one I'd say gap, and the other the sort of the harmony of faith and reason. So when I was in school, a big debate among Adventists is evolution and the role of science. How to make sense of science in Genesis 1, the literal reading of Genesis 1. And I found that Catholicism, you don't have that dichotomy necessarily because there's this harmony between faith and reason. Truth cannot contradict truth. So those were, I'd say, two big factors in helping me see Catholicism as a more complete understanding of Christianity.
Well, and certainly, more rooted historically, as
yes,
you've mentioned as well. But while we're on this, very briefly, what, if any, is an Adventist view of communion, of the Lord's Supper?
Well, it's a symbol, right? The bread represents it's a symbol of Christ, of Jesus, but not Jesus himself. The Catholics are wrong there.
As a minister, did you ever, towards the end, as you were starting to realize what the church taught about the Eucharist, and then you were presiding over just a symbol for your people, what was going through your mind as you were starting to realize what was happening on the altar at every Catholic church, and then looking at what you were doing in your own congregation?
Yeah, definitely dissonance, and I felt like, wow, well, I'm missing out and they're missing out on so much because, yeah, I was starting to attend mass too, kind of, quietly with my wife, and I had the longing to receive our Lord already. So yeah, definitely felt kind of, it was like an imitation, it's like the veggie meat. It's like the veggie meat of communion, so to speak.
That's actually a really good analogy for an Adventist. Did you have any thoughts on communion, Arthur and Teresa, before I ask you about a very unique situation regarding your transition to the Catholic Church? Like, what your thoughts were maybe about communion as an Adventist?
Well, I mean, it is, how do you even understand it? I mean, even now, when I walk up to go receive communion, it's just mind-blowing. Mm-hmm. Especially when you watch a lot of Scott Hahn's videos. I mean, to this day, I still can't believe it. And I do believe it, but I'm just saying it's a mystery beyond what we can fathom. And so I'm still on that, an amazing awe over it. It's probably the best.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Eucharist, it blows me away every time, each and every time, without fail. Growing up, they would have communion once a quarter, maybe. Yeah, and it was grape juice and some little something. And
now, were you guys the one who invented Welch's? Was that you all or no?
I think so. Yeah, I believe.
But I didn't know that.
Yeah. I don't think we invented it, but I think definitely we
definitely invented cornflakes. I'm solid on that one.
Yes. Yeah, but as far as that, it looked like they were very solemn, but I could never figure out why, and nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah,
they're like, "Oh, we're having communion," kind of in a whispered tone, and I'm like, "Well, so what are you whispering about? What's the secret?
Yeah.
What is this?" And I wasn't upset. I was really, really wanting to know, and never really got any kind of an answer out of it. So Eucharist to me is mind blowing.
That's really common in a lot of Protestant denominations. Like, it's, why are we so serious about this if it's only a... And then going back to Justin Martyr, like, you read Justin Martyr in 150 AD, and they're like, so we bless this, and just as, like, Christ became flesh, this becomes his flesh. And then we go and take, portions to people who could not be present. And I'm thinking, like, if it's just like oyster crackers and Welch's grape, why does it matter? Like, why would we go to like the nursing home and make sure every single person who's able can have, like, if it's just a symbol, then what that's a lot of mileage going from nursing home to nursing home and homebound stuff. Like, what's the point? Yeah, at a certain point, you kind of have to say to yourself, like, am I missing something here? Like,
yes,
is there more?
Well, on the same day that they do communion, they do foot washing, and all the men would go to one room, and all the other women. And my family hated the foot washing moment. So when I didn't grow up going to the communion services, because my family, I'm talking my parents, not us, but my parents didn't like that. So it was one of those weeks we avoided going to church, because it's not an obligation. In Adventism, if you miss church, it's not a big deal. You can just,
Yeah. I don't know any congregation that calls it a mortal sin like Catholicism does
to
miss church. No. So the thing I wanted to ask you, Arthur and Teresa, is that you left Adventism, but you didn't go immediately into RCIA. You shopped around a little bit. Having been formed in Adventism, like, how quickly did you realize the deficiencies of like Protestantism in general once you went from Adventism to kind of like general Christianity?
My reason for going, at first I just wasn't looking. We had an 8-year period from the time we put our resignation letter on the desk of our pastor to when we became Catholic. And for me, I just wanted to, I had been so afraid of other Christians. They were the apostate Protestantism, and I didn't even think about Catholicism yet. I just wanted to go meet all these people I was going to get to know in heaven. I went and saw every single, and I wasn't really looking for a place to land. I had no intention of ever joining another church. I was just like, no, I'm going to love I'm going to go to Lutherans. And I did for 8 years. We looked around, and then it was actually my sister, who is a Reformed Calvinist, or Reformed, I guess is the name of it. And she said, no, you can't do, that's not a good example to your children. You've got to find some place to stay. And that was when I became serious. And, we had been to we had studied all the theology of all of them, just to get to know it. I mean, not so we had to even make a decision. And, we finally just said, okay, well, if we're going to actually settle, we have to check everyone out. But because she was right, I thought she was probably right. And so that's when we looked at the last few little Orthodox.
The last Catholics
one
was Catholic
on our list.
And we didn't want to do it.
No.
We really, Lord, we don't want to do that. But we're like, okay, if we're going to fulfill our part, we have to do this.
We have to check them all out. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, within weeks of being in, talking to people online and going to RCI, we knew it was right. Every single thing in the Bible. I mean, you read the Bible as an Adventist, but you don't understand it. And then all of a sudden, you start talking to Catholic, and it all fits perfectly together.
History fits for once.
And
you don't have to try to make history fit.
It all fits. And so it didn't take us very long to realize Catholicism was correct.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of Christian traditions have really strong basis in the scriptures for a lot of things that they believe, but there's also all these kind of like weird spots in the Bible that you're like, it's probably not important. You know,
yeah,
they just kind of move on past it. But going back to Justin Martyr, we've started a series with Ken Hensley and Kenny Burchard on the Mass, and we've gone back through this passage from Justin Martyr, and there's this piece in quite literally in the Mass where Justin Martyr is saying that before everybody receives, right before the final Thanksgiving, like everybody offers each other the kiss of peace, and that so directly connects with what you see in Matthew 5 when Jesus says, if you have anything against your brother, leave your gift at the altar and go be reconciled to your brother and then return, right? And there's that's built into the Mass.
Yeah.
Right? And there are all kinds of things like that throughout the course of the scriptures that for me, I just didn't have a place for as, a Wesleyan, Methodist, Nazarene, Free Methodist guy. And I imagine, if you're viewing through the lens of just Ellen G. White, that's the case for you as well. But Norman, for you, and I'll ask this of you in a moment too, Arthur and Teresa, what was one thing that was water in the desert for you when you discovered it about Catholicism? We already talked about the Eucharist, right? And we could talk about that probably for the whole rest of the time. But what's one thing that when you discovered it in Catholicism, you were like, that's what I've been missing. That's what I've been looking for?
I'd say the connection between the life of the mind and the life and the spiritual life. Just the rootedness of Catholicism. Catholicism fulfills sort of our deepest intellectual longings, our deepest spiritual longings, and you don't have to divorce the two. So when I just encountering all these the early church fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas, for me, that was my water in the desert, really.
Yeah, well, you also, if I recall correctly, found some of my buddies, Flannery O'Connor and J.R.R. Tolkien and some others. Is there a Seventh-day Adventist literary tradition, or was that a Seventh-day Adventist imagination, or was that something you found in Catholicism that wasn't really a part of where you were coming from? Yeah, no, there's not. I mean, there's no real distinct Adventist literary tradition outside of Ellen White. So yeah, to encounter this, this long tradition of art, of philosophical and theological and literary engagement, that was beautiful. Yeah. How about you, Arthur?
I have to agree with you. Mine would have been C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and
Chesterton.
What's that?
Chesterton.
Chesterton. Thank you. Yeah, you knew it.
Well, we have to do a checklist we have to mention Chesterton once per episode. So
yes, there you go.
We got that.
We're done here.
And so for me, it came down to authority. It just came down to authority, because when that hit me, it hit me like the millstone, proverbial millstone, because then I look back at what Christ was saying and saying, that makes sense now. Mm-hmm. He's teaching his apostles. That makes sense now. He looked at Peter and said, Peter, you're the rock. That makes sense now. Mm-hmm. And it's just all the dominoes just ripped. Like you see online, those million domino fall. That's what happened with me. And so when I started to read Mere Christianity and all these other things, it's like, wow, that was the water in the desert for me.
How about you, Teresa?
You may want to edit this part out because I'm going to be really honest.
That's okay. Take a deep breath. Make sure you got your hair.
I was tired of everybody in the world telling me I was wrong because I loved being a woman. I loved babies. I wanted to save babies. I wanted to have lots and lots of babies. And I had been raised in a bunch of second wave feminists, a world that hated motherhood and hated everything about the differences between men and women. And we're pushing equality. And I hated all of that. And the truth is, Catholicism aligned with what I wanted to be so badly as a woman. It told me it was okay to believe that abortion is wrong. Because everybody in the Adventist church had said, you're crazy. You're a nut. You are obsessed. And I wanted to have 8 children more than anything. And all my Adventist family on both sides, except for my mother, because she had 6, told me, stop it. You're being bad.
Irresponsible.
You're irresponsible and you're bad. And Catholicism taught me that every instinct of as a woman that I had was what God had intended. And it made me finally have that moment of, God accepts me for who I am. He created me that way. So that's my answer.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And, we do have equality among men and women in the Catholic Church, right? But it's on a completely different basis than like what the external reality of is, everybody should be able to play with the same size basketball hoop or something. It's like this, like really intrinsic, like really anthropologically centered. It's like really Christological and incarnational in a way that just, it's massive, right? Theology of the body does not exist in other worlds of Christian thought like it exists inside the Catholic Church. But this brings up a question I did not intend to ask about, but I'm going to ask about anyway. And that involves Our Lady, because it's one thing for you to be founded by John Calvin or Martin Luther or, one of these men, right? Y'all were founded by a woman.
That's right.
So I wonder how your barriers or openness to the idea of Mary's role in the Catholic Church, like what was that like for you? Was that an obstacle? Was it less of a problem, Norman, when you were thinking through what the church teaches about Mary?
Well, for one, when I found out that we don't worship her, that Catholics don't worship her, that was one big obstacle cleared. And, understanding that the Hail Mary is a prayer that comes from the Bible. These are God's own word. This is God addressing Blessed Mother himself. So that was a big obstacle removed. And yeah, for some reason I gravitated towards the Rosary. I started praying the Rosary, every day before conversion. And I think that's also partly from my Muslim grandfather who would pray his version of the beads. So, I say that this one is a grace. I can't say it's sort of anything on my end. This is, I think, just a gift from God that I gravitated towards this devotion.
How about you, Arthur, on the Mary question?
That was a tough one for me because I wouldn't say I was a misogynist, but I definitely...
Nobody would, Arthur, to be fair, and that's exactly what a misogynist would say.
That's right. That's hilarious, yes. That's right. So for me, it was a big deal. And this is the funny thing. The first time we went to EWTN, the little lady behind the counter comes up and we're looking for anything. We're just like buying everything. We're just having such a wonderful time. And she brings up this brown scapular. I had no idea what a brown scapular was. She goes, "Oh, here, you really want to do this?" I was like, "What is it?" "It's a brown scapular." And she goes, "Here, just follow the instructions." I was like, "Oh, okay, all right, fine." So I followed the instructions. I didn't even know what I was doing. But I mean, it was definitely planned. God planned this for me because he knew how I felt about the whole Ellen White thing. And it was difficult, even though, but because of the authority that I had come into the church with, I respected my devotion to, the whole process you do for the brown scapular. I stuck with it, and it's an absolute blessing. But it was tough. It was not easy because of the Ellen White issue.
Yeah, but it was easier than it would have been because as a Seventh-day Adventist, you knew how to follow instructions.
That's right.
So there you go.
I did. I know that is good. That's good.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I marvel at is that a Baptist or a Methodist or an Episcopalian will become Catholic and they're like, come on, do we really have to do this fasting on Fridays and Ash Wednesday and all this other stuff? Right. And Seventh-day Adventists are usually like, cool, man. Right? It's not a big deal. Last thoughts on Mary from you, Teresa, before I get kind of to the last thing I want to ask.
Mary was a pretty difficult problem for me. I had resentment towards Ellen White, a lot of resentment towards Ellen White for messing up and creating a bunch of wimpy Adventist men. And so I was super okay with patriarchy in the Catholic Church. And then I realized that every miracle that happened in my pro-life movement was Mary. I'm going to cry. So it was Mary right there with me. So how can you not love her?
It's interesting, too, because you're talking about various waves of feminism, and I don't even know which wave we're on right now, but a lot of it has to do with, questions about what a human being is and what are we made for, and if we don't accept what we're made for, can we just be made into something else, and these questions. And Mary is this one thing that, she's both virgin and mother, and those are the two things that are, kind of the worst thing you can be, depending on which wave of feminism you're referring to, right? Yeah. So there's that, but again, there are people who don't understand this from the outside, and they think that we're just a bunch of rule-following people who never have any fun and don't realize that this is life-giving.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the fully, you feel more human than you've ever felt. You're finally, I can be a human being and not feel like I have to just respond to whatever everybody's ticked off about right now, or reinvent myself. And we've talked about this in some of the other episodes, try and reinvent the whole gospel just to appeal to one generation of people, right? It's this thing that this stream that's deep and wide and it's relevant to everybody in every age. But that being said, we have a few Seventh-day Adventists who do watch our shows, or I don't know if they watch them. They certainly comment on our videos. And they probably watched this far and said, come on, I still do not buy it. You guys were never really Seventh-day Adventists to begin with. You guys are exactly what Ellen White prophesied would happen. You're probably going to, track our IP addresses and come get us in the middle of the night, throw us in a sack, and who knows where you're going to take us, maybe to the Vatican. I'm not sure. What would you say to someone who is that, I would say, honorably loyal, right, to their convictions in some ways, right? That's an honorable thing to be loyal to your convictions. But just to say, just give them something to maybe think about or chew on. Norman, what would be one thing you'd ask them to consider?
Who is Jesus? Is he truly the Lord of the Sabbath, right? Is he the fulfillment of the Sabbath? Is he the one who fulfilled the temple institution, right? Or is he just someone who's subject to these institutions and laws, right? Is he the fulfillment or the one who's subject to them? And I think if we read the New Testament, it's clear throughout that Jesus is the Lord and the very fulfillment of the Sabbath, the temple. So that's one sort of idea maybe I'd have them consider and reflect on.
How about you, Teresa?
Well, I'm going to be flippant because I'm going to say, I promise you, Adventists, I will tell you if I see anything about your impending doom. And I mean that very honestly. I love my Adventist family and my friends, and I'm not going to throw them under the bus. But, Arthur and I make YouTube videos explaining the story of the Sabbath. And I urge them to watch that. And, I just don't know what to say to Adventists because they see everything as a deception. and just to let them know we love them. That's really hard for them to accept. The Catholics, we love you. And that's what I would say.
How about you, Arthur?
Well, I would say what she just said, but I would add to it this, is that at least if you're going to besmirch, let me put it that way, Catholicism, at least do it the justice like the Bible says to do and not slander us. At least when you go to research Catholicism, you come to Catholicism to research. You don't go to Jack Chick or somebody like that to research Catholicism. And that's what they do. And so they're this endless circuitous cycle of, well, this pastor in Adventism wrote something against us. Then he refers to the one before him, and it's just, everything's a circle within themselves, and they will not go to history. And if they do go to history, then they only bounce it off of the circle again. And they won't come. It's like, at least do us the justice of looking in history honestly through Catholic sources and give it an honest research. Don't just accept what is cursorily said in some Daniel Revelation seminar.
Yeah,
we're constantly slandered,
or cursorily said in some context, right? That can be lifted from some text from some pope at some point.
Yeah,
I mean, imagine
all the time. Yeah,
imagine if someone were to say, "You cannot trust Jesus. He said to hate your mother and father, or you can't follow him."
Right.
And somebody would be like, "Well, no, but you have to understand the context and what he's saying, and it's in the body of Christ's entire teaching." I'm like, I'm not interested in the body of his teaching. He said this. That's enough for me to know what he's like. Right? You can't do that to Jesus, right? Don't do that to the church.
Right.
Don't do it to the church. Right. So I would just say to anybody who's watching this far, if you were Seventh-day Adventist, chances are you're probably at least a little bit open and curious and asking some of these same kind of questions. And I would very much encourage you to go watch Arthur and Teresa's episodes of The Journey Home. I'll link them in the comments here. When Norman's episode airs here in a couple months, I'll try and make sure that he's linked down there as well. We've got a written story from Arthur and Teresa where they kind of go through this. It's called From Prophetess to Pope. It's linked at Coming Home Network's website also. In the meantime, I wish we had a lot more time to address this because Seventh-day Adventism is just such a complicated animal. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you both. Norman Ben Yazid, Arthur and Teresa Beem. We really appreciate you, and
thank you so much.
Talk to you again,
it's
hopefully
nice
down the road, because I'm sure you've generated some questions. All right, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Coming Home Network Presents. I'm Matt Swaim, and we'll talk to you again next time around.